Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and seen generations of pain staring back at you? Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried beneath the magnolia trees of the Old South, secrets so dark that even the earth refuses to forget them? Tonight, I need to share something with you. Something that changed me when I first discovered it. And I think by the end of this story, it will change you too. In the forgotten corners of Mississippi, where the Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds and the humidity wraps around you like a guilty conscience, there existed a plantation that practiced something so horrific, so systematically evil, that even neighboring slaveholders whispered about it in disgust. This is the story of Mercy Blackwood, a midwife, a healer, a woman who brought over 200 souls into this world with her bare hands. But what the Blackwood family didn't understand, what they could never comprehend, was that the same hands that gave life could also become instruments of divine retribution. If you're someone who believes that justice finds a way, even when every system is designed to crush it, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to hear isn't just history. It's a testament to the indomitable human spirit. It's proof that even in the darkest chapter of American history, there were those who refused to let evil go unanswered. Stay with me until the end. Because the final revelation of what happened on that December night in 1852 will leave you speechless. I promise you that. Let's begin. The ruins still stand today if you know where to look. Drive 17 miles east of Woodville, Mississippi, past the cotton fields that have long since returned to wilderness, past the Baptist church with the crooked steeple, past the unmarked graves that dot the countryside like scattered teeth. Turn left where the old cypress tree splits the road, and follow the path until the pavement surrenders to red clay and broken stone. There, swallowed by kudzu and silence, you will find what remains of Blackwood Manor. 3 chimneys reach toward the sky like accusing fingers. The foundation stones, hauled from quarries in Tennessee by enslaved hands that bled for every mile, still hold their positions after all these years. The brick is scorched black in places, and locals say that no matter how many decades pass, no matter how much rain falls, those burn marks never fade. They say the land itself refuses to heal. Stand there at dusk, when the fireflies begin their haunted dance and the bullfrogs start their evening chorus, and you might hear something beneath the ordinary sounds of a Mississippi evening. A humming, low and mournful. The melody of a song that has no name but carries the weight of 200 years of sorrow. Old-timers in Wilkinson County still tell stories. They talk about the winter of 1852, when the sky above Blackwood Manor turned orange for 3 nights straight. They talk about the column of people who walked out of those gates, moving north like a river that had finally broken its dam. They talk about the screams that echoed across the bottomland, screams that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But mostly they talk about her. Mercy, the woman who brought death to a house that had dealt in nothing but death for 3 generations. The midwife who decided that some bloodlines deserved to end. What you need to understand, before we go any further, is that what happened at Blackwood Manor wasn't random violence. It wasn't chaos. It was surgery. Precise. Deliberate. Earned. Every action Mercy took in those final hours connected directly to an atrocity the Blackwood family had committed. Every death mirrored a death they had caused. Every flame answered a burning they had inflicted. The Blackwoods believed they were breeding a superior class of slave. They believed that by controlling who mated with whom, by forcing brothers with sisters and fathers with daughters, they could create workers who were stronger, more obedient, more valuable. What they created instead was their own destruction. If you want to follow more cases like this, stories that reveal the hidden truths of our history, stories that mainstream education doesn't want you to know, subscribe to this channel right now. Because we're just getting started, and the deeper we go, the darker it gets. Picture the Mississippi Delta in 1847. Picture a land so fertile that a man could drop a seed at breakfast and watch it grow by supper. Picture cotton stretching to every horizon, white as snow, soft as clouds, valuable as gold. Now picture what it cost to harvest that cotton. Blackwood Manor sprawled across 4,000 acres of prime bottomland, bordered to the west by the Mississippi River, and to the east by Bayou Pierre. The main house, a 3-story Greek revival mansion with 16 columns and 42 rooms, sat on a small rise that allowed its inhabitants to survey their domain like gods observing their creation. Colonel Josiah Blackwood, the third of his name to rule this empire, would stand on his veranda each morning with a cup of coffee grown in Brazil and harvested by enslaved people, sweetened with sugar grown in Louisiana and harvested by enslaved people, served in a cup made in England from clay dug by the working poor. He would look out at his fields and see not human beings but investments, assets, breeding stock. The quarters where the enslaved community lived stretched in 2 long rows behind the main house, separated by a dirt path that turned to mud with every rain. 47 cabins, each measuring 12 feet by 14 feet, each housing between 4 and 8 people depending on the season and the colonel's mood. No windows. 1 door. A packed dirt floor that bred disease and despair in equal measure. At the center of the quarters stood the birthing cabin, slightly larger than the others, with a small porch where women could sit in the final days of their pregnancies. This was Mercy's domain. This was where she worked her craft, bringing new life into a world that would immediately claim ownership of that life. The daily rhythm of Blackwood Manor began before sunrise. A bell would ring from the tower near the overseer's house, its iron tongue announcing another day of labor. Men and women would emerge from their cabins in the gray pre-dawn light, their bodies already aching from yesterday's work, their spirits already heavy with the knowledge of what today would bring. During planting season, from March through May, they worked 16-hour days. During harvest, from September through December, they worked until they collapsed. The cotton had to be picked, the cotton had to be ginned. The cotton had to be baled and loaded onto steamboats bound for New Orleans, and from there to the textile mills of England. The overseers at Blackwood Manor carried whips made from plaited leather, each one personally inspected by Colonel Josiah to ensure maximum effectiveness. The sound of those whips cracking across human flesh became so common that the birds stopped flying away when they heard it. Even nature had grown accustomed to the horror. But the whips were not the worst of it. The worst was what happened in the breeding shed. She arrived at Blackwood Manor in the spring of 1839, purchased at auction in Natchez for the sum of $800. Mercy was 26 years old, though the bill of sale listed her age as 22. Slaveholders preferred younger women, so traders routinely lied about ages, and the women had learned not to correct them. She stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, unusual for a woman of that era, with hands that seemed too large for her frame until you watched them work. Those hands had delivered their first baby when Mercy was 14 years old. Her mother, a midwife on a plantation in Virginia, had guided her through the process, teaching her which herbs stopped bleeding and which ones started it, which positions eased labor and which ones prolonged it, which words comforted a terrified mother and which ones gave her strength. By the time she was sold to Blackwood Manor, Mercy had attended over 300 births. She knew the female body better than any doctor in Mississippi. She understood the mysteries of pregnancy in ways that white physicians, with their medical degrees and their leeches and their profound ignorance, could never comprehend. Colonel Josiah recognized her value immediately. A skilled midwife meant more surviving infants. More surviving infants meant more slaves. More slaves meant more cotton picked, more money earned, more power accumulated. He installed her in the birthing cabin and gave her privileges that other enslaved people could only dream of. She could move freely across the plantation without a pass. She could visit the big house to attend to Mrs. Blackwood, who suffered from a nervous condition that no white doctor could cure, but which responded well to Mercy's teas. She could enter the kitchen and take food without permission when a new mother needed nourishment. Most importantly, she could observe. She watched Colonel Josiah conduct his breeding program with the detached efficiency of a farmer managing livestock. She watched him pair women with their own brothers, documenting the results in leather-bound ledgers that he kept locked in his study. She watched him separate children from mothers, husbands from wives, all in pursuit of his twisted vision of a perfected slave. She learned which floorboards creaked in the big house and which ones stayed silent. She learned which overseers could be bribed with whiskey and which ones reported everything to the colonel. She learned the patrol schedules, the location of every weapon, the names of sympathetic whites in neighboring counties, and she remembered everything. The enslaved community trusted Mercy in ways they trusted no one else. She had held their babies in the first moments of life. She had closed the eyes of their loved ones in the final moments of death. She had kept secrets that could get people killed and never once let them slip. When women whispered to her about the horrors they endured in the breeding shed, she listened. When men confessed their rage and their fantasies of revenge, she nodded. When children asked her why God allowed such suffering, she had no answers, but she held them while they cried. Mercy lived in two worlds. She moved through the big house like a ghost, invisible until needed. She moved through the quarters like a queen, respected and protected by all who knew her. And in the space between those worlds, in the silence of her own cabin at night, she planned. Leave a comment below saying, "Never give up on the truth." If you believe that justice must reach all the oppressed, no matter how long it takes, no matter how impossible it seems. The Blackwood breeding program began in 1798 under the direction of the first Colonel Josiah Blackwood, a man who had made his fortune in the slave trade before retiring to become a planter. He had observed, during his years of buying and selling human beings, that certain physical characteristics seemed to make slaves more valuable. Height, muscle density, skin color, though the preferences varied by region and by era. Temperament, which white people called docility, and which enslaved people recognized as the survival instinct of the traumatized. The first Josiah believed that these traits could be intensified through selective breeding. Just as farmers bred cattle for milk production or horses for racing speed, he would breed slaves for optimal labor capacity. He would create a lineage of workers so physically superior that other planters would pay premium prices for his stock. The problem was time. Traditional breeding methods took generations to show results. The first Josiah was not a patient man, so he accelerated the process. He forced siblings to mate. He forced parents to mate with children. He forced the same genetic material to fold back on itself again and again, concentrating what he believed were desirable traits while inadvertently concentrating something else entirely. The defects. By the time Mercy arrived at Blackwood Manor, the third generation of this experiment was coming of age. And what she saw horrified her in ways that even the ordinary horrors of slavery had not prepared her to witness. Children born with skulls too large for their bodies. Children born with organs outside their skin. Children born with limbs that bent in directions God never intended. Children born blind or deaf or unable to speak. Children born with minds that never developed past infancy. And they were all connected. They all shared the same faces, the same features repeated with slight variations like a hall of mirrors reflecting a single original image. You could look at any 10 people in the Blackwood quarters and see the unmistakable evidence of their forced relatedness. The Blackwood family called them the marked ones. They attributed the defects to bad blood, to curses, to the mysterious workings of providence. They never connected the obvious dots. They never understood that they themselves were the cause. But Mercy understood. She had studied under her mother, who had learned from her mother, who had learned from healers in Africa, who understood the dangers of marrying too close to one's own kin. She knew that the blood of relatives, when mixed too often, produced weakness rather than strength. She knew that the Blackwood breeding program was creating not a superior slave race, but a doomed one. And she knew something else. She knew that the same principles applied to the Blackwoods themselves. Colonel Josiah had married his first cousin. His father had married his second cousin. His grandfather had married his niece. The Blackwood family, so concerned with keeping their wealth and their land within the bloodline, had been practicing their own version of the breeding program for generations. Mrs. Blackwood's nervous condition that no doctor could diagnose? Mercy had seen those symptoms before, in the children of the quarters born from unions too close to natural. The colonel's rages, his paranoia, his deteriorating vision? The same. The daughter who had died in infancy? The same. The son who struggled to read despite years of tutoring? The same. The Blackwoods were destroying themselves with the same technique they used to destroy the people they enslaved. And Mercy? Mercy was going to help them finish the job. Her name was Ruth, and she was Mercy's younger sister. not by blood. The connections in the quarters ran deeper than blood, forged in suffering and sealed in solidarity. Ruth had arrived at Blackwood Manor 3 years after Mercy, sold from a plantation in Alabama after the death of her original enslaver. She was 19 years old, beautiful in a way that brought her nothing but danger, and she attached herself to Mercy like a shadow seeking light. Mercy taught her everything: the herbs that healed and the herbs that harmed, the secrets of childbirth and the greater secrets of preventing it, the coded language of the spirituals that carried messages beneath their mournful melodies, the geography of the plantation, every hiding spot, every escape route, every vulnerability. Ruth became Mercy's apprentice, her confidant, her reason to keep going when the weight of witnessing so much suffering threatened to crush her spirit entirely. In the summer of 1847, Colonel Josiah selected Ruth for the breeding program. He paired her with a man named Solomon, who happened to be Ruth's biological half-brother. Their mothers were different, but their father was the same, a fact that the colonel knew perfectly well because he had orchestrated that pairing 20 years earlier. Ruth refused. It was the first time anyone at Blackwood Manor had directly refused a breeding assignment. The word spread through the quarters like wildfire. People held their breath, waiting to see what would happen, hoping against hope that somehow Ruth's defiance would change something. What happened was systematic destruction. The colonel had Ruth beaten first. 20 lashes administered in the yard while the entire plantation watched. The leather cut through her skin and her blood soaked into the red clay, and she did not scream. She did not beg. She stared straight ahead, and when it was over, she spat on the ground at the overseer's feet. So they beat her again. 40 lashes this time, then 60. Then they stopped counting. When the beating failed to break her, they tried isolation. They locked her in the punishment cabin, a windowless box barely large enough to lie down in, with no food and only enough water to keep her alive. 3 days, 7 days, 12 days. Mercy was not allowed to see her. She was not allowed to bring medicine or food or comfort. She could only stand at a distance and watch the overseer drag Ruth's weakened body to the cabin each evening and lock the door against the falling night. On the 17th day, they brought Ruth out. Her eyes had changed. Something behind them had gone dark, extinguished like a candle flame in a wind too strong to resist. She walked to the breeding cabin without protest. She lay down on the pallet where so many women before her had lain. She stared at the ceiling and did not move. When Solomon entered, when the act that the colonel demanded was completed, Ruth finally spoke. She spoke to Mercy. She said, "Remember me." That night, Ruth walked into Bayou Pierre and let the dark water close over her head. They found her body 3 days later, caught in the roots of a cypress tree, her face turned toward the sky as if searching for a heaven that had never intervened. Mercy washed the body herself. She dressed Ruth in the white cotton shift that they had sewn together during happier days. She braided her hair and placed magnolia blossoms in the braids and closed her eyes with coins borrowed from a sympathetic house servant. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not collapse in grief the way everyone expected her to. Instead, she went to her cabin. She sat in the darkness, and she began to plan. No more witnessing, no more enduring, no more waiting for a God who seemed to have forgotten this corner of Mississippi. If justice would not come from heaven, Mercy would deliver it herself. To understand what Mercy planned, you must first understand the people she planned against. Colonel Josiah Blackwood III was 54 years old in 1850, the year Mercy's planning began in earnest. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with hair that had gone silver at the temples and a beard that he groomed with the same attention he gave to his account ledgers. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they had a peculiar quality that people noticed immediately. They never seemed to focus on what was in front of them. They always seemed to be looking at something else, something invisible, something that existed only in his own mind. The colonel believed himself a man of science. He corresponded with naturalists and physicians across the South, discussing his breeding theories with the same enthusiasm that other men discussed crops or politics. He kept meticulous records of every pairing, every pregnancy, every birth, every death. He measured the skulls of infants and cataloged the colors of their eyes and documented the emergence of each new defect with clinical detachment. He did not consider himself cruel. He considered himself practical. The enslaved were property. Property existed to generate profit. Cruelty was inefficient, but discipline was necessary. And if discipline sometimes resulted in death, well, that was simply the cost of maintaining order. His wife, Cordelia Blackwood, was his first cousin and bore the unmistakable signs of their shared ancestry. Her hands trembled constantly. Her vision had begun to fail in her 30s. She suffered from what doctors called melancholia, what we would now recognize as severe depression with psychotic features. She heard voices. She saw shadows that moved on their own. She spent most of her days in a darkened room on the 3rd floor, attended by house servants who had learned never to startle her. Cordelia knew about the breeding program. She chose not to know. This distinction mattered to her. She had not personally given the orders. She had not personally watched the forced couplings. If she kept her eyes closed and her thoughts empty, she could maintain the fiction that she was a genteel Southern lady, mistress of a great plantation, beloved by all who served her. The Blackwood children numbered 3, though there had been 6 pregnancies, 2 stillbirths, one daughter who died at 3 months from a defect of the heart. The survivors were Thomas, the eldest at 23, Lucinda, 19, and William, 16. Thomas Blackwood had inherited his father's height and his mother's instability. He managed the day-to-day operations of the plantation with an enthusiasm for violence that disturbed even the overseers. Where his father saw discipline as a necessary evil, Thomas saw it as entertainment. He invented new punishments. He kept a journal of techniques. He experimented on the enslaved the way his father experimented on their bloodlines. Lucinda Blackwood had been educated in Charleston and had returned to Blackwood Manor with sophisticated tastes and a vicious streak that she disguised with charm. She tormented the house servants in subtle ways that left no visible marks but inflicted deep psychological wounds. She would befriend an enslaved woman, earn her trust, draw out her secrets, and then report everything to her father. She enjoyed the betrayal. It made her feel powerful. William, the youngest, was different. He spent most of his time in the library, reading books that his father considered inappropriate. Philosophy, abolitionist pamphlets that somehow found their way into the house, the writings of Frederick Douglass, which he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his room. He looked at the enslaved people of Blackwood Manor and saw human beings. This made him dangerous in a different way. This made him unreliable. This made him a problem that his family had not yet figured out how to solve. And then there were the overseers. Marcus Fletcher, the head overseer, had worked at Blackwood Manor for 18 years. He had started as a poor white farmer, desperate for any employment, and had risen through the ranks by demonstrating a complete absence of moral hesitation. He would do anything the colonel asked. Anything. He had buried bodies in the swamp. He had hunted escaped slaves with dogs trained to tear flesh. He had administered punishment so severe that grown men lost consciousness from the pain. Fletcher had 3 deputies who shared his disposition. Together, they formed a wall of violence between the Blackwood family and any hint of resistance. This was the fortress Mercy needed to breach. This was the enemy she needed to defeat. Not with strength, because she had none. Not with weapons, because she had none. But with patience. With knowledge. With the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had spent 11 years learning every secret this plantation held. The catalyst came in the autumn of 1850, and it came from the most unexpected source. William Blackwood. October 12th, 1850. The date burned itself into Mercy's memory like a brand pressed into flesh. It was harvest season, and the cotton had come in heavy that year, heavier than anyone could remember. The fields were white with it, and the colonel was in high spirits, calculating profits that would finally allow him to build the east wing he had always wanted to add to the manor. But the harvest had fallen behind schedule. Too much rain in September had delayed the picking, and now the bolls were beginning to rot on the stalks. The colonel, in his desperation, had ordered extended hours, 18-hour days. then 20-hour days, then something that could barely be called days at all, just continuous labor broken by brief periods of collapse. A woman named Clara fell in the field. She was 31 years old, the mother of 3 children, and she was 7 months pregnant. The exhaustion had finally overwhelmed her, and she crumpled into the cotton rows like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Thomas Blackwood, overseeing the field crew that day, did not pause. He did not call for water or rest or medical attention. Instead, he ordered 2 men to hold Clara up by her arms so that she could continue picking. When she could not stand even with support, he had them tie her to a picking frame, a wooden contraption designed to hold cotton sacks but repurposed for punishment. Her swollen belly hung toward the ground. Her arms were bound above her head, and Thomas Blackwood began to whip her. Mercy heard the commotion from the birthing cabin. She gathered her supplies and ran toward the fields, arriving just as Thomas raised his arm for the 15th stroke. What happened next would be debated in the quarters for years afterward. Some said Mercy threw herself between Thomas and Clara. Some said she simply grabbed his arm and held it. Some said she spoke words of such power that Thomas found himself physically unable to continue. What everyone agreed on was that Thomas Blackwood, heir to the Blackwood fortune, grandson of the man who had started the breeding program, turned his whip on Mercy instead. The first blow caught her across the shoulder, tearing through the thin cotton of her dress and opening a line of fire across her skin. The second blow caught her across the back. The third caught her across the face, and she felt something crack, and her vision went white with pain. She did not fall. She did not run. She stood there, bleeding, and she looked at Thomas Blackwood with eyes that held no fear, no submission, no acknowledgement of his authority. She looked at him the way one human being looks at another. And that was the worst offense of all. They dragged her to the punishment cabin. They stripped her of her dress and left her in the darkness with her wounds untreated and her future uncertain. The colonel himself came to visit her the next morning, not out of concern but out of curiosity. "You protected a field hand," he said, "a field hand who had failed in her duties. Explain yourself." Mercy's face was swollen almost beyond recognition. Her words came slowly, squeezed through pain. "Clara was carrying a child," she said. "Your child, your investment. I was protecting your property, Colonel. Nothing more." The logic, perverse as it was, gave Josiah pause. He had indeed bred Clara with one of his premium males. The child she carried was expected to fetch a high price at auction or to serve as a foundation for the next generation of the breeding program. He released Mercy from the punishment cabin. He even had her wounds treated by a white doctor from Woodville, an expense he would never have authorized for an ordinary slave. And he considered the matter closed. But for Mercy, the matter had just opened. She had felt the whip meant for a pregnant woman. She had looked into Thomas Blackwood's eyes and seen nothing there. No conscience, no hesitation, no recognition that the people he tortured were people at all. That night, alone in her cabin with her wounds throbbing and her heart cold with purpose, Mercy made her final decision. The Blackwood line would end. She would end it. Mercy spent 2 years building her network. She started with the women she had helped through childbirth, women who trusted her completely, women who had whispered their darkest thoughts to her during the vulnerability of labor. One by one, she approached them. One by one, she shared her vision. One by one, they joined. There was Hannah, a cook in the big house who had access to the kitchen and the family's food. There was James, a blacksmith who could forge tools that looked ordinary but served other purposes. There was Solomon, the same Solomon who had been forced to violate Ruth, a man destroyed by guilt who saw in Mercy's plan his only chance at redemption. There was old Samuel, who could read and write despite the laws against it, who kept track of patrol schedules and drew maps from memory. There was young Eliza, just 17, who worked as a seamstress and could move through the house without drawing attention. There were the field hands who knew every inch of the swamp, every hidden path, every safe crossing. 47 people in total, 47 conspirators bound by suffering and united by hope. But the most important recruit came from the most impossible place. William Blackwood. He came to Mercy in the spring of 1851, under the pretense of seeking treatment for insomnia. She made him tea from valerian root and chamomile, the same tea she made for his mother, and she waited. "I know what my family does," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've read the ledgers. I've seen the breeding charts. I know about the children born with defects, the ones who disappear. I know everything." Mercy said nothing. She had survived too long to trust a Blackwood, even one who seemed different. "I want to help," William continued. "There's a network, conductors, safe houses, a way to get people north. I've been in contact with them. I can provide money, supplies. Passes that look authentic." "Why?" Mercy finally asked. "Why risk everything?" William was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice cracked with emotion. "Because I am what my family made. These hands," he held them up, turning them in the lamplight, "have never worked a day in their lives. Everything I have, everything I am, was built on suffering I didn't choose, but have benefited from every single day. I can't undo that, but I can stop it. I can make sure my family never hurts anyone else again." Mercy studied him. She had delivered babies who grew into slaveholders. She had watched children corrupted by the system they were born into. But she had also seen exceptions. She had seen moments of conscience break through the conditioning. "If you betray us," she said slowly, "everyone involved dies, including me, including people I love more than my own life. You understand this?" "I understand." "Then welcome to the resistance." With William's help, the plan took shape. The date was set for December 23, 1852, when the Blackwoods would host their annual Christmas Eve ball. Over 100 guests would attend, white planters from across the region, politicians from Jackson, businessmen from Natchez and New Orleans. The overseers would be distracted by security duties. The house servants would be exhausted from preparations, and most importantly, every member of the Blackwood family would be in one place. The escape route was mapped through the swamp to a rendezvous point where conductors from the Underground Railroad would be waiting. William had arranged for a steamboat to be anchored on the Mississippi. Its captain paid handsomely to ask no questions. The method was elegant in its simplicity. Mercy knew herbs that could kill. She had spent her entire adult life studying them, cataloging them, learning exactly how much was needed and how long it would take and what symptoms would appear. She had never used this knowledge offensively, but she had always known that the day might come when she would need it. She called it the silent deliverance. No weapons, no violent confrontation, just judgment, administered through the same substances the Blackwood family consumed every day without suspicion. The timing had to be precise. The dosages had to be exact. The escape had to begin the moment the effects became irreversible, and everyone had to play their part perfectly. December 22nd, 1852. Mercy moved through the chaos of preparation like a woman who had already seen the ending. She checked on Mrs. Blackwood, administering the usual tea for her nerves. She visited the kitchen where Hannah worked, exchanging a glance that said everything words could not. She walked the quarters one final time, touching the hands of those who would walk to freedom tomorrow night, memorizing faces she might never see again. That evening, she gathered her conspirators in the root cellar beneath the smokehouse. 47 souls crowded into that dark space, their breath visible in the cold December air. "Tomorrow," Mercy said, "everything changes. Some of us will not survive what comes next, but those who do will carry our story forward. They will remember. They will tell their children, and their children will tell theirs, until the day comes when no one is ever owned again." She distributed the final assignments. Hannah would prepare the special dishes for the family's private dinner before the ball. James had forged keys to every locked door in the manor. Solomon would disable the alarm bell. Old Samuel had the maps. Young Eliza would signal when the moment arrived. William Blackwood had left travel passes hidden in a hollowed tree near the north boundary. He had also written letters to be mailed after everything was over, confessing his family's crimes to newspapers in New York and Boston. The signal would be a single candle in the third-floor window. When it appeared, the exodus would begin. December 23, 1852. The Blackwood family took their private dinner at 6 o'clock, 2 hours before the guests would arrive. It was tradition, a moment for the family to gather, to toast their success, to congratulate themselves on another profitable year. Hannah served the meal herself: roasted duck with blackberry reduction, sweet potatoes glazed with bourbon, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and wine. Bottle after bottle of the French Bordeaux that Colonel Josiah prized above all others. Mercy had spent months perfecting the preparation. The compounds she used were odorless, tasteless, derived from plants that grew wild in the Mississippi bottomlands. They would take effect slowly, mimicking natural illness, raising no suspicion until it was far too late. By 7 o'clock, Colonel Josiah complained of a headache. By 7:30, Thomas excused himself, his stomach churning. By 8, when the first carriages began arriving, Cordelia had collapsed in her room, and Lucinda was vomiting blood into a porcelain basin. The ball proceeded without the family. Guests were told that a sudden illness had swept through the house. Concern was expressed, prayers were offered, and the dancing continued because wealthy people had traveled a long way and were not about to waste an evening. In the private quarters, Mercy moved from room to room. She stood over Colonel Josiah as his breathing grew labored. She leaned close and whispered in his ear, "Ruth sends her regards. And Clara. And every child born broken because of your experiments. And every mother forced to breed like livestock. They all send their regards, Colonel." His eyes widened. He tried to speak. No sound emerged. "Your bloodline ends tonight," Mercy continued. "Not just here. Forever. You wanted to breed something superior. Instead, you bred your own extinction." She did not stay to watch him die. There was too much left to do. At 9 o'clock, a single candle appeared in the third-floor window. The quarters erupted in controlled motion. Bundles were grabbed. Children were lifted. The old and the sick were supported by the strong. 47 people moved in absolute silence toward the north boundary of the plantation. The overseers were occupied with the ball, managing carriages and watching for thieves among the guests. They never saw the column of shadows slipping through the darkness. Solomon led them through the swamp, following paths that only he knew, paths that kept them hidden from the patrol roads. The mud sucked at their feet. The cold water soaked their clothes. But no one complained. No one stopped. Behind them, Blackwood Manor began to burn. James had set the fires carefully. The east wing first, where the breeding records were kept, then the main house, then the overseer's quarters. The flames spread with terrifying speed, fed by the dry winter wood and the December winds. By the time anyone organized a response, there was nothing left to save. The column walked through the night and into the dawn. They walked through the next night and the next dawn. They walked until they reached the river, where a steamboat waited with its engines already running. William Blackwood stood on the deck. He helped them board one by one, pressing money and papers into their hands. When Mercy reached him, he paused. "You should come with us," she said. "There's nothing left for you here." He shook his head. "Someone needs to stay. Someone needs to witness. Someone needs to make sure the truth is told." He pressed a leather satchel into her hands. Inside were the breeding ledgers, the only copies that had survived the fire, evidence of everything the Blackwood family had done. "Tell the world," he said. "Promise me." Mercy promised. The steamboat pulled away from the shore as the sun rose over the Mississippi. Mercy stood at the stern, watching the smoke still rising from Blackwood Manor, watching the only world she had ever known disappear into the distance. She did not feel joy. She did not feel triumph. She felt only a vast, terrible emptiness where her rage had been. But beneath the emptiness, something else stirred. Something she had not felt in 25 years of bondage. Hope. The destruction of Blackwood Manor sent shockwaves through Mississippi and beyond. Official reports called it an accident, a kitchen fire that spread too quickly, a tragedy that claimed the lives of Colonel Josiah Blackwood, his wife Cordelia, and their children Thomas and Lucinda. The escaped slaves were listed as presumed dead in the conflagration. but the truth could not be contained. Letters arrived at northern newspapers within weeks, written in William Blackwood's hand, detailing decades of forced breeding, systematic torture, and calculated dehumanization. The breeding ledgers were copied and distributed. Abolitionist speakers quoted from them on stages in Boston, Philadelphia, New York. More importantly, the method spread. Throughout 1853 and 1854, similar incidents occurred across the Deep South. A plantation in Alabama burned to the ground, its owner and overseers dead from mysterious illness. A sugar farm in Louisiana was abandoned after its entire enslaved workforce vanished overnight. A cotton operation in Georgia collapsed when its well water was found contaminated with substances no one could identify. Slaveholders began calling it the Mercy. They did not know the name's origin. They only knew that something had changed, that the absolute power they had wielded for generations was no longer absolute. William Blackwood was arrested in January 1853. He confessed to everything. He was tried, convicted, and hanged in March of that same year, the first white man in Mississippi history to be executed for crimes against enslaved people. His final words, reported by newspapers across the country: "I die gladly, knowing that I helped end what my family began." Mercy never reached the North. Federal marshals, operating under the Fugitive Slave Act, intercepted the steamboat near Cairo, Illinois. Most of the escapees scattered into the night, disappearing into the network of safe houses that stretched across the free states. Many eventually reached Canada. Many more were recaptured and returned to bondage. Mercy was recognized immediately. Her face had appeared on wanted posters throughout the South, offering a reward of $5,000 for her capture. She was shackled and transported back to Mississippi to stand trial. The trial lasted 3 days. Mercy refused legal representation. She refused to speak in her own defense. She sat in the courtroom with her back straight and her eyes forward, watching the parade of witnesses with an expression of profound disinterest. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she rose slowly to her feet. "I delivered 217 children into this world," she said. "I watched 143 of them sold away from their mothers. I watched 61 of them die before their 5th birthday, most from defects caused by forced breeding. I watched 39 women broken by what was done to them in the breeding shed." She paused, letting the numbers sink in. "You ask if I regret what I did. I regret that I did not do it sooner. I regret every day I spent watching and waiting instead of acting. I regret that I could not save more." She looked directly at the judge. "You can kill me. You cannot kill what I started. The fire is lit. It will not go out." She was sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out on April 15, 1853. On the morning of her execution, Mercy walked to the gallows without assistance. She climbed the 13 steps without faltering. When the hood was offered, she refused it. Her final words, witnessed by hundreds and reported across the nation: "I die free." They buried Mercy in an unmarked grave outside Woodville, hoping that obscurity would erase her memory. It did not work. Within months, songs began appearing in the quarters of plantations throughout the South. Songs about a woman who could walk through walls, a healer who could bring death, a midwife who delivered an entire people from bondage. The songs changed with each telling. In some versions, Mercy escaped the gallows and lived to old age in Canada. In others, she returned as a spirit, appearing to enslaved people in their darkest moments, whispering that freedom was coming. In still others, she never existed at all, but was a symbol, a collective expression of resistance too dangerous to attribute to any single person. Artifacts appeared. A brass button said to be from her dress. A lock of hair sealed in a locket. A wooden spoon she supposedly used to stir the poison that killed the Blackwoods. None of these objects could be authenticated. All of them were cherished. Scholars today debate the historical record. Some argue that Mercy was real but her story was exaggerated. Others argue that she was a composite, multiple women whose acts of resistance were combined into a single legendary figure. A few argue that the Blackwood breeding program never existed, that it was abolitionist propaganda designed to inflame Northern sentiment. The breeding ledgers, however, survive. They are held in the archives of Howard University, available to any researcher who wishes to see them. The names, the dates, the detailed records of forced pairings and their outcomes, the cold, clinical documentation of systematic genetic experimentation on human beings. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look. And in Wilkinson County, Mississippi, where the ruins of Blackwood Manor still stand, something else survives. Every December 23rd, on the anniversary of the silent deliverance, people gather at the site. They are descendants of those who escaped that night, traveling from across the country to stand where their ancestors found freedom. They light candles. They sing the old songs. They speak the names of those who did not survive. And always at the center of the gathering, someone tells the story. The story of a midwife who decided that some bloodlines deserved to end. The story of 47 people who walked through fire and water to reach freedom. The story of a woman who faced the gallows with her head unbowed and her spirit unbroken. The story of mercy. If you watched until the end, it's because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know you and understand who truly cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Mercy's story touched your heart. Share it so that her memory is never forgotten. And subscribe to this channel, because there are more stories waiting to be told. Stories of resistance, stories of courage, stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things in the face of unimaginable evil.